Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Rev Dr Keith Garner, Superintendent and CEO of Wesley Mission.
Very warm welcome to the Wesley Theatre here in Sydney. The reality is I begin a series of 6 addresses which take us right into the heart of some of the most critical and crucial passages in the whole of the Old Testament. The overriding theme of Exodus gives the title to the book in the books of the law, the Torah, but the title is a description of what it's really all about. The title is defined by the name that concerns the deliverance from bondage of a people. The nature of God is the one who sets people free. The nature of God is one who delivers, who redeems, who makes fresh and new. When we turn to the New Testament, there's a very clear link between Moses and Jesus that we do well to note. We see the great prophet, Moses, and we see the great Savior, Jesus Christ, the one and only. Yet the two have a very clear relationship. The gospel sees, if you like, the completion of the intent of God. And clearly, that message of freedom and hope is one that is adopted not by just Jesus and the disciples, but one that all his followers ought to be a part of. Now, in the opening chapter of Exodus and the early part of chapter 2, we see how the Israelites had multiplied. Now, you can see the relevance of this when you understand our own situation at the present time across the world. They became a security risk. You see, they didn't know how to handle this increased number of people. The Hebrews were greatly burdened, and the Pharaoh ordered the midwives to destroy the infant boys. This is certainly a very adult story. It's very interesting that it's a story that in children's Sunday school has often been lovely focus for pictures of the basket on the water and all the stories of Moses. It's a very adult story if we understand what is actually happening. It reflects something of the harshness of life that was inflicted upon God's people. We've got the familiar account of how the infant Moses was placed in a sealed basket and was floated on the river by his mother, found by the Pharaoh's daughter, nursed by his natural mother, but adopted by the Egyptian princess. The survival of Moses is in itself remarkable. It's an indication that the slaughter of the innocents, much as in a similar account in the escape to Egypt at the beginning of Matthew, communicates that such evil cannot ultimately win. And the following chapters transport us from the birth of Moses to the Exodus, the momentous wilderness wanderings. One of the most significant narratives that have defined any peoples anywhere in the world is in those wanderings in the wilderness. And Exodus recalls that God has aroused his people to seek help in removing them from slavery. God was clearly at work in the life of Moses, preparing him for the enormous, momentous task of leadership that was given to him. When we turn to chapter 3 and those first 15 verses that was read to us here in the Wesley Theatre, when we turn to those words, whether at home or here together, we see in a quite specific way how God revealed his glory through the willingness of somebody to be used by him. Without question, Moses is the supreme character, figure, and leader of the Old Testament. The prophets are important, but it is Moses that is used by God to lay down so much of that which will determine and set the pattern of this Jewish people. He becomes not only important in that sense, he's a liberator, a lawgiver, the leader of a people, the prophet of a nation, the one who will help shape what we know as the people of God. There's a real romance about the story of Moses in the proper use of that word. But chiefly we see it in the calling of the prophet. We must ask questions about what this has to say to those of us that in some way in our lives are seeking to find God's guidance, God's leadership, God's will, God's purpose in our own lives as we reflect upon the call of Moses. Moses has a unique place in the Christian tradition. We have only to examine the accounts of the Transfiguration in the Gospels to see there that at that moment when Jesus gathers that small inner group, not only the 12 but the 3, takes the 3 on the mountainside, it is of course Moses and the great prophet that join him in what is an account full of mystery, but certainly makes it quite clear of the position of Moses in terms of importance. Much of the teaching of Jesus does not discard what Moses had to say. And if, as we've been exploring for weeks and weeks, we took the book of the Gospel of Matthew as an example, Matthew seems to take the pattern of 5 books within his one Gospel. And when we come to the Sermon on the Mount, between chapters 5 and 7, it seems to be that Matthew sees that laying down some pattern of the way of life for a community is so very important. There's much to be gained for examining the call of Moses. Because of the place in Pharaoh's palace, you could say, and some might say, that Moses was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, or certainly raised in that way. All he had to do was to play things smart, and he would have been set for life. But Moses, of course, does one thing that fundamentally changes everything. He is seen as one who slays an Egyptian. From that moment, his life is set in an entirely different pathway. Moses fled for his life to Midian and looked after his father-in-law's sheep. He went from the palace to the fields and then to the remote desert. What a journey! Just capture that in your mind. From the palace to the fields to the desert. This is the making of a leader. In the most difficult of circumstances for us to even begin to grasp in our own lives. His life was changed irrevocably when he took his stand for justice. Well, that's what it was. It was during this time that God spoke to him, and the rest is history. It becomes not only history for us to read, it becomes national history for the making of the people of God and for the people that eventually we describe as the Jews. We can learn much if we prepare to closely examine the call of Moses. Firstly, Moses was about his everyday business. Now, I think that's so very important. Now, Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. Surely he ought to have been at the synagogue or in the temple or at least at church when his call took place. But no, it happens while he's doing something that he did every day of his life. He received in that everyday experience the awe-inspiring call of God. I find it helpful to know that Moses was doing the ordinary when the extraordinary sense of God's presence comes across his life. It's important to recognize that you don't have to be involved in super religious things to be conscious of God. And I find it actually interesting that so many stories tell the same tale, really. That as I was going about whatever it is I go about, there the holy God, the God of creation, the God who has spoken clearly in the person of Jesus Christ, encountered me. It was not my journey to him, but his journey to me that made sense of my call. Perhaps the one overriding thought is that Moses was faithful to what he was doing. Isn't that worth just noting? He was faithful. That was what he was meant to do, and that's what he did. Moses' encounter with God takes a place that was far removed from the religious community that he would eventually know what it is to lead. To a people where the patterns of religious life were so clearly set down and articulated, it happens in a place that is so removed from that. And in the fields, God spoke to him. And in the desert, God would speak to him, this great man of God. There's no prophet or priest on hand. Nobody to interpret the experience to him. Nobody to say, Moses, let me explain exactly what's happened here. Nothing of that. But in that place, God speaks to him. However, it's worth noting this will not be the last time that God speaks with clarity through shepherds in the field. One aspect of the calling is that nature and the presence of God combine. I find that interesting too, because we have lots of conversations in theology classrooms. They talk about natural theology. We talk very often about creation and what its place is in understanding the presence of God. But here somehow, That which is in nature and that which is the God that speaks out of life combine out of a burning bush. Moses turned aside for a few moments to look at the wonder of the bush. And the might of the story is that it burned but was not consumed. It is not the burning of the bush. That's an everyday experience that really, quite honestly, is not necessarily full of any message. But it's the fact that it was not consumed that is the power of the scriptural story. Jewish rabbinical teachers and leaders have talked about these events, and they talk about divine condescension that they see in this event. They see this as an account where the God who is the creator somehow enters into his creation in a quite specific way. The God who comes and becomes lowly. I'm more likely to be drawn to a person who hears the call of God in the ordinary than I am by those who constantly are obsessed by the remarkable. Moses' life had many aspects of failure about it. Let's just for a minute think about Moses' life. This is the great man. However, his life is full of failure. Remember, he attempted to deliver the Hebrew slaves. And we'll talk about it in a few weeks. Even when he delivered them, they groaned and moaned and grumbled. He would hardly feel he was successful in all of that. He didn't enter the promised land. He was going to lead them to the promised land, but he didn't enter the promised land. Plenty of failure, you might say, about that. The disobedience over smiting a rock, the need for another kind of leader in Canaan, and so on it goes. So Moses was about his everyday life when God called him to a quite specific and historic mission. The glory of God was found in the ordinary. The fatal fascination of the fabulous has attracted many religious people down the years. Oh, it becomes so attractive to say, we're a mighty, strong church. We're bigger than all the rest. You know, Jesus wouldn't even own the speech because we proclaim a God who is strong and mighty, but we are anything but that. And the fabulous is attractive. It does have something about it. We like to be the X factor of religion. We like to be those who sparkle and shine and are dynamic and stand apart from the rest. But Moses, in his own, the great leader of a nation, had far too many failures to get the vote. They'd have kicked him off at first branch and show. That's the reality of this man. Some Christians are even conditioned to say that God speaks through the unusual. Now, I understand that because it does feel remarkable. When you look back with that wonderful gift of retrospect on the way that God blesses your life, it is often looking back at experiences. You see how the Holy Spirit of God was involved in your life, and you look back at it, and that which was ordinary becomes extraordinary. But it was ordinary, and the emphasis is all upon God. Moses stood in awe of the spectacular, you might say. But I think that's a wrong take, because he saw something he might have seen every day, and within it, the extraordinary power of God. Edmund Burke, the noted 18th century political philosopher, turned a phrase into a profound truth. History is full of momentous trifles. It's a wonderful insight, really. We may find the most extraordinary meaning and purpose in everyday events. Methodist devotional writer Neville Ward concluded the present moment is the only moment in which any kind of action is possible. If I want to do the will of God, I must recognize that the divine will always be something I must do now. I cannot receive now what God will offer me tomorrow, but I can receive now what he's offering me now. And each moment God is offering me some grace for my acceptance and some command for my obedience. From the wonderful pen of Catherine Marshall, we read, the purpose of all prayer is to find God's will and to make that will our prayer. So here is Moses in something he always did, tending the flock of the sheep for the family. And there he's led to a place which became known in every way, not only in that moment but later, as a mountain of God. The heat in the desert would have been considerable. I've no doubt in my own mind that Moses would be used to seeing dry thorn bushes set alight. There is nothing unusual about that at all. However, it's not the fire, it's that the bush was no different. Even though it burned, even though it had been set on fire. It's not the only time that God would speak to Moses in fire. You can read in chapter 19 there, fire is involved as well. We shall read in later journeys in Exodus, he will lead a people with a pillar of fire. So fire has a very important part to play for Moses. He's drawn by the fact it doesn't consume the bush. His sense of inquisitiveness is so important. It drew him closer. God wanted the attention of Moses. And you know, have you ever, in your own experience, ever had times when you could say afterwards, I think God wanted me to take him seriously. I think God was calling me to really take notice at some point in my life. To look a little closer. To listen a little more attentively to the voice of God in everyday living is important if we're to be called by God. Here in another places, fire is a symbol of the holy, cleansing presence of God. People were, of course, regularly used to taking off their shoes or sandals in the presence of God. Many Christian people make a great deal of this, but it was normal, everyday practice in holy places for people to do that. What was strange was for it to happen here. This helps us to understand the importance of Moses' response to God's instruction. Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground, it tells us in verse 5. God is always contemporaneous to our experience. It's not helpful to put God in the past tense, and it's also inappropriate to forward move the tape, as it were, into the future. It's inappropriate to talk about once knowing God, or God once helped me. It's also inappropriate to talk about one day I will come to him, one day he will be near me. The truth is, God is always near us. It is in the present moment that God longs to speak to us, draws us closer to take attention. And when we are drawn closer, then there is no other response than to take off our shoes. For we're in the presence of a holy God. The practice of taking off our shoes is worth just consideration for a moment. I think there's a couple of things that it does. First of all, for me, it reminds me that I'm not chummy with God. In fact, it's the exact opposite of some of that fabulous stuff I talked about a few moments ago. That we are in the presence of a holy God. This is God we're talking about. We must never domesticate God and reduce the Almighty to the pal next door. Secondly, I think it reminds us a little of the mystery of faith, though I am prepared to accept that some people push this too far in the study of a passage of this kind, reading over into the passage things that are of later cognizance. But surely this theme is important in a world where we continually just seek to put the mysterious and push it away. Our Christian faith has an element of that. And certainly Moses would come out of this experience feeling very much the presence of God, but also feeling that the holy God who is beyond him has called him into a new experience. When we stand in the presence of a holy God, we discover that the immanent and the transcendent somehow meet together. Many people are drawn to God by way of a specific happening in their life. Just in the same way that we're talking about Moses calling here, how many people, if they were to reflect on their own experience, could reflect and say, that particular happening in my life, somehow God elevated that to a new place, or rather brought me to understand that God was in that place. Whilst it's true that from time to time God speaks in and out of our strengths, I think I could go as far as to say there are far more times when he speaks out of our weakness and out of our failures and out of our difficult moments. And God speaks to people and calls them and calls them to a new place, so much so that you might have prophets say, I can hardly speak. I'm not educated enough. I don't have the gifts. I don't have the calling. But God touches tongues like he did with Isaiah, with a coal of hot burn upon the tongue. That sense of call that is so important. Many testify that God speaks through tough times and when experiencing life's challenges. Walter Brueggemann, one of the great writers on the Old Testament, described the first 15 chapters of Exodus as a narrative of liberation. He says all about liberation. Now, you can read it at lots of different levels. Clearly, it's a passage about the liberation of a people, but it's also, I think, helpful to read it and understand it against the liberating power of God, which we know in Christ. He warns that the narrative concerns no ordinary happening, and we must not expect to understand it through our usual categories. With this in mind, I find it not only interesting, but helpful to find a link between curiosity and calling. Moses is drawn a little closer. That's the critical moment, maybe, in the call. Maybe it's at that moment when choice comes into play. So you have two things that often in Christian theology and thinking and reflection are often separated. One is the divine initiative and the other is the human call. Somehow, when Moses is drawn that bit closer, he does not deny that it is God that has taken the initiative, but recognizes that his moving closer is so very, very important. We can't hide from God. A preacher who had a great influence on my early life frequently used to recite the words of Francis Thompson from his outstanding work, The Hound of Heaven. I fled him down the nights and down the years. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinthine ways out of my own mind, and in the midst of tears I hid from him under running laughter. God often, dare I say, chases us and calls us to take attention to whatever it is at a point in time he wants us to see. Then thirdly, the presence of God leads Moses to a clear personal calling. In verse 10 we read, so now go, I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. What a calling. The same God who had made promises to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. Now these promises are going to be fulfilled in one huge act of rescue. A consistent theme is presented to us that the God of the Bible calls us to share in our own lives. God would save his people, and Moses is going to be used in the process. What would Moses feel after this calling? He's going to be used by God. As we stand of those who are called in Jesus Christ, he invites us to humbly take our part in his mission call today. And it seems to me helpful to reflect upon this great giant from the Old Testament and say, these are the parts and component parts of calling for us. What does it mean for us to have a distinct calling? For there are clearly ways in which people are called to unique and distinguishable tasks. God singles Moses out for a quite specific journey and calling. But God continues to call people. He may call you. There may be something that he wants to say to you that is quite specific about your calling. When we consider Moses' life, we recognize how, in a sense, his human life was preserved by his parents' faith. We need to identify the fact that he is not to be captivated by the attractions of the royal court. Gosh, how many would have got themselves involved? Wouldn't we have taken a safer line? Wouldn't we have said to ourselves, I'll sort that out later, I'll have a quiet word with the people that are acting wrong here. I won't go out and risk everything by standing up for my brother slaves. But he did. One writer coined Moses' vocation as a maker of history and a friend of God. Without question, the experience of the bush that burned and was not consumed is a formative moment in life. I think that's one description that's an adequate description of a calling experience. It is formative. It gives shape. It helps to make us who we are. Once we've sensed the call of God, then somehow that will always be the place that we look back to. That will be the place that gives somehow the formation that will be our present experience. Moses might well have considered what his chances of success are. I mean, if you analyze what you've been called to do in life and you say to yourself, now I want to work out what the success chances are. If we had, as we do now in any business, in any commercial activity, if we had a risk analysis, I mean, if we sat down with Moses and said, now this is what you went measuring, you've been asked, I know you work with the sheep, let me explain to you. You've been asked to go to the Pharaoh to set the people free. Now, where does this stand on the risk analysis? About his own life? About his own ability of success? About the challenges and things that will come along that might skew the direction and the call? What are his chances of success or even survival in relation to Egypt? They're modest at best. However, God's calling is greater than us. And is always greater than us. So when we do our own risk analysis, we say to ourselves, we don't want to be called back because something is difficult, because something is going to be very demanding, or that there are risks of failure. We're not doing this because of the guarantee of success in ourselves, but we are doing it because God has spoken and called us into his way. Every person needs formative experiences which will give shape, confirm meaning, and bring dynamic purpose. Out of the burning bush came a voice that would change his life forever. In his study of Exodus, Rev Charles, who probably wrote as much as anybody on Exodus, observed that God gave Moses an awesome new vocation. And that each of Moses' objections, everyone he raises, looked back. And it was God who looked forward. So we thank God for this great man, Moses, this great leader of a people. And we say, Lord, speak to us. Maybe not out of a burning bush, but whatever its equivalent is, whatever it is that we shall meet tomorrow, and let us see your way, hear your voice, and perceive your will. And may we have the grace, even if we do raise our objections like Moses, to take up the calling and live it out. Amen.